Hello, in this Vodcast we're going to be learning about hazardous waste. And our learning targets are to describe the methods of handling hazardous waste, explain why hazardous waste is one of the most serious environmental concerns, and explain how hazardous waste can enter the environment from a disposal site. First of all, what is hazardous waste? Well, hazardous waste is waste that threatens human health or the environment. It can be poisonous, it can be dangerously chemically reactive, it can be corrosive, or it can be flammable. Two largest classes are organic compounds. These are solvents, pesticides, PCBs or dioxins, and heavy metals, which can be lead, mercury, or arsenic. We covered all of these in the unit on toxicology, so if you want to find out how these things affect us, please look in that unit. And developed countries produce 80 to 90% of the world's hazardous waste. The problem? Well, unfortunately, like most environmental problems, it took a disaster, or in fact 2 disasters, to bring the environmental issues to the fore. The most famous one was Love Canal, and here's a video about the problem with Love Canal.
From 1947 until 1952, the Hooker Chemical Company used the Love Canal section of Niagara Falls as a dumping site for toxic waste.
President Carter declared a state of emergency today in the Love Canal area of New York's Niagara Falls, where toxic chemicals were discovered oozing from the ground.
That discovery in a Niagara Falls neighborhood triggered an environmental battle that played out on national television and became one of the most iconic in U.S. history. After the federal government finally evacuated hundreds of families, new laws were introduced to prevent future love canals.
Occidental Chemical Company agreed to pay $129 million.
My 3 kids were born with birth defects. My wife's had cancer.
In the spring of 1978, a Niagara Falls housewife read a newspaper story about her neighborhood, known as Love Canal.
It described 20,000 tons of chemicals buried 3 blocks from my home, that these were very toxic chemicals. And I was just in shock.
The chemicals had been dumped in an old canal by the Hooker Chemical Company in the 1940s and early 1950s, and then buried. Now, they were leaking into some of the homes closest to the canal.
For several years, chemicals have been seeping into the basements of a number of houses, including this one. The evidence is always there.
There was a report that talked about the different chemicals getting into people's homes, getting into their gardens, their backyards.
The people that were living there were smelling these odors in their basements. Many of the children claimed that they had skin rashes, and before you know it, there was a concern.
There have been instances of birth defects and miscarriages among neighborhood families.
The state had been testing the neighborhood's air, soil, and groundwater and made an announcement for the homes closest to the canal.
The New York State Health Department recommended that pregnant women and children under the age of 2 immediately move out of the area.
How many chemicals have been identified as being underground here? So far, we know of 88 specific chemicals that have been identified. And of those 88, how many are suspected of causing cancer? I think the number is 11.
You could see the fear on some of their faces today as men, women, and children gathered for blood tests to determine whether those here have developed abnormalities.
I am really, really afraid. We have decided we're going to get out one way or another. But right now, you just can't jump, and where are we going to go?
We were a working class community. We didn't have money to just up and move and abandon our house. So we organized the Love Canal Homeowner Association, which was all of our neighbors.
Lois Gibbs was trying to start an organization, and she quickly learned how important the media was to be their voice.
Would you please tell me, do I let my 3-year-old stay?
New York Governor Hugh Carey ordered the state to buy the first 2 rows of homes along the canal, and those residents moved out. But Lois Gibbs and some 700 other families living outside the evacuated area were told they were not in imminent danger.
They put up a fence, and every time I went in and out of the driveway, I seen the fence, and I was told that people on that side of the fence had to leave and I had to stay, which didn't make sense to me at all.
Over the next 2 years, some of the remaining homeowners continued to battle for relocation, saying living near the polluted canal was putting their family's health at risk.
I lost a baby before it was even born. My next door neighbor had a stillborn. Her son is sick. Her son is sick. How many more kids have to be sick?
Some of the protesters used provocative tactics, such as burning effigies of Jimmy Carter, his wife, and daughter.
Today, the Environmental Protection Agency announced...
But things changed in the spring of 1980. The EPA had conducted a preliminary study that indicated that residents may have increased chromosomal abnormalities. But before the agency could confirm the findings or inform the residents, the study was leaked.
EPA was in a panic because they knew that this awful chromosome study was going to hit the newspapers. So they had an emergency team rush out to Niagara Falls to talk to these people.
We found two particular characteristics in this study which are ominous.
Environmental Protection Agency had done some blood work on some residents, and they said they had an unusually high number of chromosome breakages and higher risk of cancer, birth defects, or genetic damage in our children. People gathered at the Love Canal homeowner's office, and they started shouting and screaming. So when the EPA officials came over, the residents were so angry that they decided that if it's so safe to live at Love Canal, these two officials can live here, and they're not going to get evacuated until we get evacuated.
The standoff lasted just 5 hours, but the point was made.
President Carter was running for re-election. This was making headline news across the country. As a result of that sit-in and that protest and those hostage holdings, the federal government agreed to evacuate everybody at Love Canal, buying their homes. So we were out.
The residents of Love Canal celebrated today.
We got relief, we got safety, we got our lives back.
700 families started leaving Love Canal this afternoon.
It was the moment. It was the moment of relief in a sense that we're free.
Remember that we stood up here at Love Canal, ordinary, law-abiding people, and we weren't afraid.
Following the evacuation, Gibbs became the public face of a movement to clean up toxic waste dumped by companies across the country. To deal with this pollution, Superfund legislation was enacted.
Superfund was established so if another Love Canal came on the horizon, there would be money there. You could go in, you could do the testing, you could do the cleanup, and then you could go after the responsible parties.
While sometimes criticized as costly and bureaucratic, Superfund has led to the remediation of nearly 400 toxic sites. Love Canal was among the first addressed, but it took nearly 2 decades and cost more than $350 million. Because the landfill turned out to be too big, too toxic, and too expensive to move, it was capped in clay and surrounded by a drainage system.
And the other was Valley of the Drums, and the picture you see here is not Valley of the Drums. Valley of the Drums was a much larger version of this. You see here is an example of midnight dumping, where some company decided to illegally abandon drums of hazardous chemicals in a field somewhere. And the U.S. produces 700 million metric tons of hazardous waste per year. Half of these are chemical products, 10% are e-waste or electronics, 10% are oil products, and 10% are coal products. There are up to 1,000 abandoned waste disposal sites with hazardous material. These sites are from before there were regulations, and these regulations basically began with Love Canal. As you can see in this picture, storage barrels can corrode and leak. When this happens, the hazardous waste can contaminate the groundwater. And also, dumping liquid waste in unlined ponds can reach the groundwater, since there is no lining stopping the hazardous waste from sinking below the pond into the ground. There are 3 levels of priorities. Most countries do not do this, and the United States is one of the ones that don't do this, but to a certain extent we do. First level priority is to produce less hazardous waste. This is done through changing industrial processes and through recycling and reusing. The second level is to convert the hazardous waste into a less or non-hazardous substance. This is done through natural decomposition, incineration, thermal treatment, chemical, physical, and biological treatment, or by dilution in the air or in the water. The last level priority is to put the waste into perpetual storage. It can be put into a secure landfill, it can be put into an underground injection well, it can be put into surface impoundment, it could also be put into underground salt formations. Now we come to legislations. There are 2 major legislations. The first one is called RCRA. for short, and this is the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. It was first passed in 1976, and then it was amended in 1984. And the Environmental Protection Agency sets standards for management of several types of hazardous waste, and it issues permits for companies allowing them to produce and dispose of them in acceptable ways. This is known as the cradle-to-grave system. The companies must keep records to keep track of these substances from the moment it is created until the substances have been disposed of in an approved manner. Unfortunately, this act only regulates about 5% of the hazardous and toxic wastes. The second law is the Comprehensive Responsive Compensation and Liability Act. This was passed in 1980, and then it was amended in 1984 and 1986. It's also known as CERCLA or the Superfund Program. This is one that was passed in response to Love Canal. Its goal is to identify and clean up on a priority basis hazardous waste sites. It sets procedures and policies on how to release hazardous substances into the environment, for example, landfills. It manages a list of sites which had produced or is likely to produce the most serious environmental problems and establish a revolving fund, which is called Superfund, to clean up the worst abandoned waste sites. The money in Superfund was supposed to be maintained by a tax on oil and chemical companies. That law expired in 1995, and Congress did not renew that law. So there's no law financing Superfund anymore, so Superfund is now broke. So now when polluters cannot be found, taxpayers have to foot the cleanup bill. Of course, when the polluters can be found, have to foot the cleanup bill. And people have the right to know what toxic chemicals are being stored and released in their community. And right there's the website for you to find out. E-waste, in a sense, is in a class by itself. E-waste contains quite a few hazardous chemicals in them and quite a few heavy metals in them too. And in fact, recycling them, which has to be done, is frequently done in not the best of ways, as you'll see in this video.
Did you ever wonder what happens to your old computer or TV when you throw it away? Chances are some of your electronic junk ends up here in China, the world's biggest dumping ground for electronic waste. Electronic waste, or e-waste, arrives by the truckload to a southeastern Chinese town called Guiyu, where locals are experts at ripping apart electronic trash. There are e-waste disposal businesses here on nearly every street. And in mom-and-pop operations like this, workers rip apart the appliances and pull out the most valuable elements and components for resale to future manufacturers. They worked fast, identifying and sorting plastic with the help of a flame. The women here tell us all the trash is foreign, even though Chinese law bans the import of electronic waste. The most valuable electronic guts, like circuit boards, are separated and the rest treated like some giant plastic harvest. Workers take piles of plastic chips and mix them into what looks like a synthetic stew. The men here say this plastic will be resold to the company Foxconn, which makes parts for Apple's iPhone. Guiyu may be one of the world's largest informal recycling operations for e-waste, but it is dirty, dangerous work.
When recycling is done in primitive ways, like what we have seen here in China with the electronic waste, it is hugely devastating for the local environment.
Greenpeace says the water and air in Guiyu is terribly polluted. I am walking on flat screens. These come from laptops or from computer monitors or video TV screens, and they can contain a highly toxic chemical, mercury. And you can see how those chemicals could then seep into the environment and even into the food supply of nearby livestock. Locals insist it's cleaner here than it used to be.
When my family moved here 6 years ago, this place was flooded with trash. But now it's much better. The authorities cracked down pretty hard and banned people from burning plastic.
But talk to someone who doesn't rely on e-waste to make a living, and you get a very different story.
Do you guys drink the water here?
These migrant farmers say they don't dare drink the water. And One of them has a shocking admission.
It might not sound nice, but we refuse to eat this rice that we plant because of all the pollution. We don't know who ends up eating this rice.
Workers here complain their business has been hurt by a crackdown on e-garbage smuggled in from the U.S., Europe, and other Asian countries. But as Chinese consumers become more wealthy, the country is increasingly generating its own electronic waste. That puts new pressure on China, as well as the rest of the world, to figure out a cleaner, safer way to dispose of all this electronic junk.
Now, as of 2015, in New York, it is illegal to throw out e-waste with the regular trash. So what you can do is apartment buildings are able to have another bin for recycling e-waste. Or there will be recycling events throughout New York City where you can take your e-waste to a Staples or to Best Buy, and the nearest one to our school is one in Great Acres Mall, or to Salvation Army. The nearest one is in Elmont. Batteries, that's not really e-waste. However, some batteries, particularly the rechargeable batteries, contain some heavy metals that you do not want to get into the groundwater, particularly when you get your drinking water from the groundwater. What you can do with the batteries is you can take those to any store that sells them, and they have to take those for the recycling. Non-rechargeables used to be hazardous, but today they no longer contain mercury, so they're not hazardous anymore, and those alkaline batteries, just throw them out with the regular trash. Now we come to what you can do with the waste. First is detoxify. Physical methods. Physical methods basically are separating the hazardous waste from the non-hazardous waste. Charcoal resins will filter out the solids. Distillation will separate the liquids. Different liquids have different boiling points, so as you heat a mixture up, the chemical with the lowest boiling point will boil up first, then you collect that substance as vapor, and then you condense it, then you got the pure substance of that. Now, extremely hazardous substances can be encapsulated in glass, cement, or ceramic, and those will then be put into a secure site. Chemical methods will react and change the hazardous substance into a non-hazardous substance. Also with nanotechnology, tiny magnets can attach to oil organics, and then you put a magnetic field through it, and that will remove those substances from water. Bioremediation will use living organisms, mainly bacteria and the enzymes, to convert hazardous materials into harmless substances. This takes longer, but it costs less. Phytoremediation is using plants, and here you can use natural plants or genetically engineered plants to selectively filter pollution from the ground. Some plants are able to take heavy metals out of the ground, and those heavy metals will then be incorporated into the plant. One negative thing about this is that those plants will then become toxic to animals if they eat them. Another negative thing about this is that it's only effective where the roots can reach. But this is an inexpensive method, and the plants are very easy to establish. Incineration. This is done at a very high temperature. Now this is considered to be waste treatment rather than disposal, because the waste is converted into something which is not toxic, which is ash, and also gases, which are not toxic. And the ash residue then is landfilled. The advantages of it is that it is mobile. You can move the incinerator from place to place. It is small, and the ash is not toxic. Disadvantages is that it costs quite a bit, and the gases that are produced are carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas, and carbon monoxide, which is toxic but not as toxic as other things. And it can also vaporize and release some toxic metals and radioactive elements. Now, secure landfill is a way to bury the toxic materials. And it's very similar to a sanitary landfill, which we covered in an earlier vodcast, but it has extra precautions to ensure that the leachate does not leak out of the landfill and into the aquifer. And that you can see in the diagram over here. And you can see there's some differences between the secure landfill and the sanitary landfill. You can see there's a clay dike and there's a leachate collection basin, which you didn't see in the sanitary landfill, nor did you see the leachate going to a wastewater treatment plant. Then there's a surface impoundment, which basically is a pond. A pond is either man-made or it's natural. At the bottom of the pond, there's a plastic liner to prevent seepage, and the waste then settles underwater. It's not used anymore in the sense that there aren't any new ones, and the reason why it's not used anymore is because eventually there will be seepage, and also there can be evaporation, and during huge storms the pond can then overflow due to heavy rains, and that can cause flooding, and that can cause major problems if the hazardous waste overspills out of the pond. Deep well disposal is another way to dispose of the waste, and in this case the waste is buried into permeable rock, and it's buried below the aquifer. So if it leaks out, it can't get into the aquifer because it's already below it. It will go down, but it won't enter the water. One problem with this is that the possible sites where you could have this are limited, and those sites have limited space. The advantages are that these are safe if the sites are chosen carefully. If there are problems, the waste can be retrieved from the deep wells. This is easy to do, and it's not costly. There are disadvantages in that there can be leaks and spills at the surface. The well casing that's also at the surface can corrode, and that can cause leaks. There can be fractures, and earthquakes can also fracture it, and that can allow the waste to escape into the groundwater. Now we come to our conclusion questions. 1 and 2 basically go together. List the 3 levels of priorities, and give an example of each of those levels of priorities. And for each example, explain why that example is an example. That brings us to the end of this podcast, and I will see you in class tomorrow.